The Enneagram isn't just a concept or an idea. It's a companion that helps us better understand our lived experience as humans with unique histories and stories. But over time, we have all learned to immediately and unconsciously avoid and suppress certain parts of ourselves in order to make our way in the world. And this shows up in our inner work. We quickly resist even noticing parts of ourselves. In this episode, we're talking about one of the core tenets of the Somatic Enneagram work, which Marion calls radical inclusion. This is also not just a concept, but an experience that we work with in order to reclaim our wholeness and welcome all parts of us home. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
A through line of contemplative work is a non-judgmental posture, especially when it comes to our own internal work. And one thing that I heard early on from you is the concept of radical inclusion. And you make it a point, when you gather people in a room, in a circle, and when you work with people, even when they get down to themselves individually, you invite them to be with what is difficult for them. So I'd love to start this episode just by asking you what radical inclusion means to you.
Radical inclusion is very simple. It is representing wholeness, oneness, wholeness, inseparability of everything belongs.
I like the sound of that.
So, our type structure would love it, in fact, because it's a 9 where you resonate the most, right? That's what you're after, harmony, peace, and just this innate sense of belonging.
Right, but you nuance it for us, which is a big learning for me.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, and that's something that we know is represented by spirituality and religion. But when it comes to the Enneagram, we see, or often just in our own selves, sometimes we don't want to include things, or maybe part of our pattern is that we, as a head type, sometimes it's difficult for me to get to my heart. So it's not that I am not including what's going on in my heart, but sometimes I'm more actively excluding versus more actively including. So what is going on with this inclusion exclusion thing?
Well, just because we're human beings, we are bound to learn to exclude and create an either or world.
Mm,
So what I mean by that, we're always looking at two opposing forces, one that is wanted and the other one that isn't wanted. Yeah.
mhm.
So in your case, as a type 5, of course you want to, you know, gather wisdom and knowledge, right? That is a want. I want that. That is going to give something that is going to ultimately make me safer.
Yes.
But that goes into the background because your focus on acquiring wisdom and, knowledge is allowing you to stay in your head, focused in your head. And you're learning that as soon as you go down below the neck, there is this cloudiness, this confusion, this stuff that's unclear and interfering and invasive almost. Yeah. So where it actually interferes with your clear thinking.
Mm,
You
mhm.
have to learn how to push that down and to not want to feel that part of you below the neck because it is overwhelming you and your experience, even though you may not know that in the beginning when you are learning the Enneagram, is that if I am not clear, muddled, and incompetent, and I get into this space of not knowing what's happening, I am experiencing overwhelm in my body. And that overwhelm in my body is going to potentially become a threat to my survival.
So how does that work for, let's say, the heart center or the body center types?
For the heart center types, their orientation is in their heart and maintaining the relationship. Yeah. And there is, of course, a very nice description of the 2, 3, and 4 that are reaching out for connection and how they do three different ways, but they externalizing themselves. Yeah, they are pushing their hearts out there in order to not feel that initial hurt in their heart by somebody disconnecting from them, either rejecting, disapproving, or abandoning them. And especially if that happens at a young age, we are experiencing that we won't make it if that person is going to leave us. It's not just because we feel better when they're there because of the connection. Even if that person is not good enough in that department, we are attached to them. That is it's everything to do with the attachment theories. Yeah. You have to be sufficiently attached to something in order to feel safe when you're little and you can't take care of yourself. Yeah, that is necessary for your survival. And that is carried forward in the development and the ways that your feelings were heard create overwhelm in the heart center, and that becomes something that's not wanted. So you're excluding it. And then the belly center, has its own version of that, that it feels that by being in the belly, generally, they are connected to their survival strategies and their ability to make their body do things in the world. And inadvertently, they are really understanding the need to belong as a very important thing. And that's an existential thing because from the human race perspective, we're operating in clans. And we do that because in clans, we are stronger than the one person that has to deal with not only the elements, but also the predators, right?
Right, right.
So we will be taken out. So if we are being extricated out of a group or out of a clan, all of a sudden we feel like, oh my God, I'm not going to survive this. Overwhelm comes into the belly and it begins to be afraid of losing their belonging to a clan and to a group. And they will do in three different ways everything they can to bring something to the table, a skill, a talent, a gift that they bring to the clan in order to come back in and be taken back up into a group or clan. Yeah, so they're beginning to exclude that overwhelm in their belly that has to do with who they are separate from a clan, not not so strong, right? Much more vulnerable to being overtaken or overpowered.
The way that I experience this is that from a head perspective and from a fives perspective, that I am sort of this gathering person, that I'm always gathering, gathering, gathering. So for me, it's enlightening to learn this idea and to say, actually doing the reverse becomes what is also included. So to actually make space in my own life to not know something is to actually include everything else. So it's so interesting for me because as sort of an information gathering type, the prospect of stopping the gathering is not something I'm really all that interested in, but it is the way that I find like my personal growth, and that is true, for all of us. There is sort of the reverse becomes where the work is.
Yeah, but to also understand that you are naturally, according to your human development, you've learned to become defended against it. And
Mhm.
that is what you meet when you understand spiritually that we're all one. Everything is one. The whole world is created out of the one. And out of the one came the three. And out of the three comes the many, right? There's something about this cosmology that the Enneagram actually brings that is very important teaching, that it will take you to the obstacles to the experience of your spiritual nature that happens when you go inside consciously with the intention to do a counter instinctual movement towards something that you don't want to feel.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's mind blowing because we can say, I'm ready to do the work all we want, but it is a real trip. And Just to take it back to that body center, it's really fascinating hearing you talk about it this way with belonging, because the autonomy is what comes forward in the body types of, I got to figure out how to do it myself and I have to have agency. So to recognize that that is actually excluding something that is even more core to survival, which is that belonging in the group, that just clicked differently with me when you said it
Yep.
just now.
Yeah. And ultimately, all these patterns were created since you were very little. And then you keep repeating it because, the survival needs of the body and the homeostasis of well being is being prioritized by the nervous system and by the body. And that inserts itself very young, making the first track in the virgin snow. And then, you keep going into that same track that then becomes a path. And that path is much quicker in its conductivity going into your brain. And now it becomes a pattern. And that's why it's called conditioned. Yeah. The condition is I have one part that I go towards, and that's what I bring to the world that's going to get me something from the world back. And that is the belonging, it's the relationship, and it is the validity for my existence. Yeah. For the three different, body, heart, and head centers. And that's not so easy to work with.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, right. So just beginning to say, let me work with my thinking brain
Yeah.
and then have to get into the body, into the heart to include all of those. Or,
Yeah.
like a lot I know a lot of twos. So I relate most in the heart center to twos. So a lot of twos talk about like having a lack of that sort of thinking where like it's the reverse is true almost for the two. It's hard for them to get to the five. Right,
Yeah.
so they are more comfortable from a heart place being in a body place, but to get to the head space is a more complicated space to get to for them.
Yeah. Yeah. So we all have these challenges on the way of radical inclusion or, to understand that if you exclude even the tiniest little aspect of the reality as it actually is, you are not being able to experience wholeness. And wholeness is a spiritual state.
Yes, yeah. That's what's so amazing about the somatic work is that it is doing that inclusion of all of us.
Yes.
It's so powerful being in spaces with all 9 types and being affected by watching them reshape their conditioning, and it not just watching, but, of course, I'm a body type, but we all have that resonance and that understanding in the field when things shift, in those moments when something connects or a center comes online. It's so grateful to have been in those spaces, and I'm curious how you've seen this work reshape people's connections with each center, not just their home center, but the other centers as well. Like, what starts to happen as people go deeper and deeper into this work?
Well, so yeah, it is sort of the second step, right? Because typically the people first, when they do the Enneagram work, they work with their own type that belongs to their center. And they stay there for quite some time as if they don't have the other two centers or they don't have to pay so much attention to it. And that's actually not true. They're already not paying much attention to it. And that's the habit. So, Aaron just asked, well, how do you know that you're excluding things? Well, if you just are interested in your own type and that center, that is your lead center, yeah, or the subtype that you lead with, you're excluding by nature all kinds of aspects of yourself. Of course, we have a beautiful head with a brain that has largely three different aspects of this brain connecting with all three centers: the heart center, the belly center, and the head center. Yeah. So if you look at how we have been created, I mean, it's so stunningly beautiful that even the people referring to the head center in the Enneagram, all they do is go to the mental. And I said, your head center has all three brains. Yep. Your head center is physical. You can touch it. It's part of your physical being as well. And you can approach the head center from a somatic inquiry point of view. That's news to a lot of people. You can experience your heart center from a somatic point of view. You can begin with an emotion or you can begin with a belief. But the moment you go in and you say, okay, so how does that feel? And where do you notice that belief in your body? Sometimes that belief that's up here is actually noticed somewhere else. And it may point to an emotional charge in your body that has created the image of whatever that event was in the brain that then is being resisted. So it's all interactive. This is all one. You cannot talk about wholeness and keep, sectioning out your body as if it's three different, not related aspects of your being. That doesn't make any sense. And yet that's what we've learned to do, is to exclude.
Right. And so the inquiry process and the way that you teach the somatic process allows people to move down into their body, into their hearts, into their belly centers, and then to realize or have experience with body sensation, feeling, and then locating that. And is always interesting when, especially when people find something there down below their necks. They find something, and in the process, we will be sort of dropped in and then quickly bounce up to our brains, and our brains sort of take us out of that moment. And
Yeah.
it's really a fascinating thing to see happen and then to be guided back down. But it's just speaks so much to the power and control that our brains have. And I don't just mean the head center, but like the actual how the brain is running our life. And I love how you say it runs in the background. The pattern runs in the background.
Yeah. And what you said was so beautiful because when you are actually going from this heart back up to the brain, you lose your connection with your inner observer and go into
Hmm.
mental categories of the way that you want to gather information. Yeah, so this is one of the foundational elements. You can't do this work unless you stay in your inner observer. And what I heard you say, when I observe that movement to my head, means that you'll have enough of an inner observer observing that you went from here to here in the more
Hmm.
aspect of your brain. Yeah. So
Yeah.
observer needs to be online for you to notice it and then to bring your attention back.
Right, right.
Uh,
It's the attention part that is that we easily so bounce up and down.
yeah. And it's interesting too, watching the invitation to include the head center without getting so back in it that we lose contact with that inner observer. And I think that's sometimes will catch people off guard when they are starting to grasp the concept of radical inclusion. But I think some of us, myself included, have felt so overburdened by the brain that I sometimes want to exclude it because it runs my life so much of the time. And I think, oh no, I'm back in my brain. And to watch the compassion with which I've seen you and I've been a part of it in other ways, like to say, what if we include that that's happening without needing to follow it?
Yeah. So the most important part, rather than conceptually try to include it, is for you to notice, how that affects you. So there was a part of you says, oh no, I'm back in my head again. That's resisting what just happened. And the moment the resistance comes in, or you're already wanting to exclude the movement that just happened, instead of saying, oh, look, there's my pattern again. Of course, this is what I do. This is what I've learned to do many, many times. So for you then to know that you need to include that movement up to your head, stay in your inner observer instead of trying to fix it, change it, or go to, okay, now I have to learn how to include it. conceptually, I would say let go of the concept, because radical inclusion is an experience.
Mm.
Not a concept, right? You can't conceive wholeness. You can say all kinds of words, but it's not going to take you to the experience. So in this case, if you notice like, oh no, this is where I'm going again with my head, just notice, oh, something in me is scolding me inside for having gone somewhere again. So that is an aspect of you that has to do with the superego that wants to keep control over this particular movement that just happened. And you're back in your pattern. Yeah. So if you can just notice that movement, and the moment you notice it, just name it. Oh, I went to my head in order to figure it out. Okay. Thank you, head, for doing what you have done for me until now. But now I'm going to go back and I'm going to see where in me I need to go. That was my intention to go, and see if I can resource myself first before I go back there. Because that's what made you jump out. Anyway, it gets a little
Yeah.
complex in the nitty-gritty, because there's so much complexity in our psyche and our soul and our humanness and our spirituality and how it interacts. So I want to not get too nitty-gritty, but I just noticed you say that one thing that I know would take you out of it.
Yeah, and I appreciate you speaking to it because I think that's such a fruitful place for discovery, for me certainly, and for a lot of people, is to notice when we can't have compassion for what's happening inside. And that's often when we need that compassionate presence of a facilitator to help rewire that in. A lot of us didn't have voices in our ears saying, "It's okay that this happened. Look, it's happening. And what are
Yep.
you gonna do now?"
And there's no doing for a minute. Yeah. There's just, can I allow that? And just recognize what just happened without having to do anything about it other than recognizing it. Yeah. And then you're free from it. The moment you recognize what it is, it's like, oh, of course, that's where I'm going to go. This is what I do. Yeah. And then to include it, and then be free to return your attention to where you needed to go. That was, of course, too much for you, right? Because you wouldn't have gone up to your head.
Yeah, that moment of allowing, and I'm really hearing being able to recognize, acknowledge, say hello to the resistance so that you can have some space and then see where you are and in real time without that and quick, even like I did now, saying, "Now I have to go somewhere else." It's like, can we breathe into the acknowledgement of what's happening? And that in and of itself is so powerful.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying. The concept is so different from the experience.
Well, it's so, what I would say, it's so counter what we learn in school, what we learn from the interactions with the people around us and what people want us to be and who they want us to be. So we believe from that, you know, that part of us that we've learned to exclude. And therefore, that's where the sacrifice lies. This is where you can't really experience wholeness. Yeah, you can talk about it, but you can't experience it.
Yeah, I relate to that so much from the work of contemplative practice. We're so much better at it in in a meditation practice when we realize that we've wandered off. We're so much better at it of just letting ourselves off the hook to say, like, I just can come back to my breath, right? That's really that non-judgmental work of like, just come back to your breath and recenter. And that's really the same thing that's happening. It's just that when we realize it's happening, we get very judgmental about it. Instead of holding a non-judgmental space for ourselves, we get very like, oh, I'm doing this or I'm doing that. I shouldn't, I have to bounce out or come back. But really is learning that to just stay with it.
That too, include the super ego too. If
Right.
what's happening? Oh, there you are. Yeah, you want to fix things. I get it.
Mm-hmm.
Stands that there is something different to experience that has nothing to do with either exclusion or choosing what you want. It has to do with experiencing who you are created to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So including that includes including ourselves.
And all that what is conditioned, learn to acknowledge it, recognize it, and return to your intention of what aspect of yourself created that diversion, because that diversion is the adaptive strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And it has its own function. It is not doing anything wrong. It doesn't need to be fixed. It just needs to be recognized so that you can drop your attention back down again to wherever it was, knowing that you maybe were trying to get closer to something that needed to be resourced more before you could tolerate being with that part of yourself. Yeah, that's basically what it's saying.
Right. It's really reminds me of parts work and this idea of there are no bad parts of us. Everything has a function. They need to be welcomed, said hello to. And really, this key piece of doing it in the body with the somatic awareness online to make that space. You always invite us, like, can you make some space for that? And, as again, it's such a simple concept, but it's so profound when it does that shift in the body.
I just I just have to interject one thing. There are bad parts of us. Yeah? Especially when they're separated from the good ones.
Mm.
Yeah? But when the bad parts and the good parts are finding each other and they begin to reconcile with each other, something totally different happens. And in that wholeness, the good and bad have a place. And it isn't acted out, it isn't starting to run the show because you're not feeding the bad any longer by trying to push against it, by trying to push it down, by trying to hide it somewhere inside of you so that it can actually continue to be the disturber in the field that you intuit you don't want anybody to see. And now you're really in a lot of pain and suffering in that job of, keep splitting yourself in the either or world, having to hide one part and bringing forward into the foreground the other part. Yeah, so the work is to bring these pieces in contact with each other so that they can become whole, like the yin and yang symbol. Yeah, there's a little bit of good in the bad, and there's a little bit of bad in the good, and they are creating the one.
Mm.
It's interesting to kind of reframe bad as still something that I don't know how you would define it, but to say it's all here. And, this whatever we wanna look at, labeling those opposing parts, it's important to acknowledge that there are opposing parts that need some reconciliation.
Yeah, instead of control and resistance, which keeps them in place and separated.
Yeah, it's so brilliant, and I just always appreciate hearing you talk about it in various ways because I think too that's what helps us not just stay with the concepts, but to start to feel into what is that like hearing that come into my being? What is that like when it's happening near my heart? What is it like when it's in my belly or my shoulders or my face? And that's the experience of doing this work really that core component, that moment.
And you can see that I never talk about it exactly the same way because, however it's coming into me, that is current in me, as well as in the conversation, that's where it's alive in this moment. And there's principles here, but you cannot really bullet point those, right? I mean, how do we bullet point things? Yeah, we can say something about we are three centered beings and the three centers need to be fully experienced in a reconciled way before and spiritual experience can download really in your conduit, right? You can say that because that's true, but how to get there? And you can say something about the challenges for 9 in where they are primarily located according to their habit of attention, the habit of their emotion, and the habit of their contracted defensive reactions, as well as the holy ideas and the virtues and the nourishing reflexes. But that's just highlighting such a surface thing, because it gets hidden as we begin to work with it. And I need to listen very carefully. So when I heard you say that one phrase, I knew you were out of your inner observer. That where you say, oh no, this is coming up. That's resistance. And the resistance has a concept about this being bad and this cannot happen. So, that's a beautiful teaching moment. And that's kind of how I teach, because to me, it makes the most sense. And there's also part of what I'm beginning to write now for each type. So there is more to be written up, but not to the point that we can make this a cookie cutter recipe.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Somatic Enneagram podcast. You can learn more about Marianne Gilbert, her teachings, and sign up for her training modules by visiting mariannegilbert.com or somaticenneagram.com. The Somatic Enneagram podcast co-hosts Karen Burley and Aaron Maines are both trained in the Marianne Gilbert method and work with clients in person and online. Head to the show notes to learn more. Help us grow this podcast by subscribing, leaving a review. Please share it with your friends. Until next time.